The night I helped my neighbor get over his marriage, while his wife was not around, was definitely the most exciting night I have ever experienced in my life. I used to think that men nearing 60 settled into their routines, didn't have much left to yearn for, especially when it came to love or anything near it. The men I'd known growing up, older uncles or family friends, seemed to fade quietly into the background of their own lives as they aged, but my 59-year-old neighbor, Mr. Davison, quietly dismantled that misconception with every subtle glance, every moment we shared, and every unspoken word that hung in the air between us. Mr. Davison lived alone most of the time. His wife traveled frequently, visiting family in another state, and it left their home eerily quiet. From the outside, everything about him seemed ordinary. He kept his yard immaculate, his car always washed, and his porch light glowing warmly in the evenings. It wasn't until this past summer that I began noticing the small cracks in that polished surface, revealing something far more complex underneath. It started with a quiet evening on my porch. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the street in shades of gold and amber, and the cicadas buzzed in the warm air. I had settled with a book in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the other when my gaze wandered across the street. Mr. Davison was sitting on his porch, the faint glow of a cigar ember flickering as he took a slow drag. His expression was distant, as though his thoughts had wandered somewhere far away. At first, I didn't think much of it. I chalked up his demeanor to the long day and the absence of his wife, but something about the way he sat shoulders slumped, gaze fixed on the horizon, stuck with me. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was loneliness, a kind I understood deeply. For the next few nights, I found myself stealing glances at him. Sometimes I caught him staring off into the distance. Other times, he seemed to focus intently on the drink in his hand, as though it held answers to questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. The longer I watched him, the more the mystery of his quiet sadness pulled at me. There was something deeply human about it, something raw and unfiltered. One night, as twilight painted the street in soft lavender hues, I noticed him again. He was leaning against the porch railing, a glass of whiskey in hand. For a moment, he glanced in my direction, catching my gaze. It wasn't awkward. It felt like a silent acknowledgement, like he knew I'd been watching. Instead of turning away, I decided to act. "Evening, Mr. Davison," I called out, my voice breaking the comfortable quiet of the neighborhood. He hesitated before offering a small wave. "Evening, Ethan," he replied, his voice carrying over the warm air. It was low and smooth, like the faint hum of a distant train. I stood, crossing the street before I could overthink my decision. As I approached his porch, his eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. He smiled faintly, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Not at all. Company would be nice." The chair creaked softly as I sat, and for a while neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative, like we both understood there was no rush to fill the space between us. Finally, I broke the quiet. "Rough day?" I asked, nodding toward the whiskey in his hand. He chuckled, a low sound that carried a hint of self-deprecation. "Not particularly, just thinking." "Thinking about what?" I prompted, curious. He took a sip, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "About how life changes, about how it stays the same in ways you don't expect. Marriage, work, all of it. You wake up one day and you realize how much of your life has been spent for others." His words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted. "Don't get me wrong," he added after a moment. "I'm grateful for everything I have. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, you start wondering if you missed something along the way, something you didn't even know you wanted." I glanced at him, his profile illuminated by the soft light spilling from the porch. There was an honesty in his expression that I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," I said finally, my voice soft. "We get so caught up in what we think we're supposed to do that we forget to ask ourselves what we want." Mr. Davison turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I wondered if I'd said too much, but then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're wise for someone so young," he said, his tone teasing but warm. I laughed lightly, shaking my head, or just good at pretending. That made him laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the air around us. It was the first time I'd seen him let go of the weight he carried, even if only for a moment. It felt like a small victory. And as the evening deepened, we talked about everything and nothing. He told stories from his younger days, about his job, and how he'd met his wife. I shared bits of my life too, how I'd moved here a few years ago, my work, my own struggles with finding my place in the world. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I enjoyed his company. There was something comforting about his presence, like sitting beside a steady fire on a cold night. Eventually, the conversation slowed, and we sat in companionable silence, watching the stars blink into view. I could feel his gaze shift to me every now and then, but I didn't turn to meet it. Not yet. There was something unspoken in the air between us, something fragile and undefined, and I wasn't ready to break it. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I've felt this at ease. Thank you, Ethan." His words caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "I'm glad to be here." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the quiet intimacy of the moment settling around us. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden revelation. It was a connection, simple and profound, that neither of us had anticipated. And as the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. And I can tell you, the beginning it was. This was only the kickoff of something I could never have imagined, not even in my wildest dreams, because the nights after that first conversation felt different. It wasn't as though anything monumental had changed, but there was a new layer to my evenings. I'd find myself on the porch more often, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Davison across the street. He was usually there, sometimes with his whiskey, other times just leaning back, letting the stillness of the night envelop him. And when our eyes inevitably met, it felt like an unspoken invitation. It didn't take long for our porch conversations to become routine. A nod from him or a wave from me was all it took, and I'd find myself crossing the street, drawn to his quiet presence. There was a rhythm to our talks, a flow that made the hours slip by unnoticed. Mr. Davison spoke with a calm confidence, his words measured but meaningful. I began to understand the depth of his thoughts, the way he carried years of experience with a mixture of pride and quiet regret. And one evening, as the cicadas hummed in the background, Mr. Davison invited me inside. "I realized I've been hogging the comfort of my porch," he said with a smile. "Come in, Ethan. Let me repay your company with a proper drink." I hesitated, surprised by the sudden shift, but his easy demeanor put me at ease. "Sure," I said, following him into the house. The inside of Mr. Davison's home was exactly as I imagined: neat, understated, and warm. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents ranging from history to fiction. A faint scent of cedar lingered in the air, mixing with the faint traces of cologne that clung to him. It felt lived in, comfortable, a stark contrast to the loneliness I'd imagined. "Whiskey?" he asked, gesturing toward a well-stocked cabinet in the corner. "Why not?" I replied, settling onto the plush leather couch. He poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the light as he handed one to me. "To good company," he said, raising his glass. Damn, he was so attractive when he did that. "To good company," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The first sip was smooth and warming, a perfect match for the atmosphere of the room. Mr. Davison took a seat in the armchair opposite me, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. He watched me for a moment, as if weighing his words before speaking. "You know," he began, "I wasn't sure about you at first." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? What changed your mind?" He chuckled softly, swirling his glass. "You're persistent and honest. Most people don't bother looking past the surface, but you see more." His words caught me off guard, and I found myself searching for a response. "Maybe I just know what it's like to feel overlooked," I said quietly. "It makes you notice things in others." Mr. Davison's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. "You're a good listener," he said. "It's rare to find someone who listens without trying to fix or judge." There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure there yet, but something in his eyes told me he wanted something from me. "I think sometimes people just need to be heard," I said simply. He nodded, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to mine. "You're right, and it's been a long time since I felt heard." The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, and it tugged at something deep within me. I wanted to tell him that he deserved to be heard, that his thoughts and feelings mattered, but the words felt too heavy to say aloud. Instead, I offered him a small smile, letting the silence fill the space between us. As the evening wore on, our conversation drifted to lighter topics. Mr. Davison shared stories from his younger days, tales of road trips with friends, late-night adventures, and the mistakes that had shaped him. His laughter was rich and genuine, and I found myself captivated by the way he spoke, the way his eyes lit up when he recounted a particularly vivid memory. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, his glass resting on the armrest. "It's funny," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "When you're young, you think you have all the time in the world, but then life happens, and before you know it, you're 59, wondering where the years went." I nodded, understanding the sentiment even though I was years away from experiencing it myself. "Do you ever feel like you missed something?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. Regret doesn't change the past." His honesty was disarming, and I felt a sudden urge to share something of my own. "I think everyone has those moments," I said. "I'm only 24, and I already catch myself wondering if I'm on the right path." Mr. Davison looked at me, his expression soft but serious. "You've got time, Ethan," he said. "More than you realize. Don't let fear stop you from living." His words stayed with me long after I left his house that night. There was a wisdom in them, a perspective I hadn't considered before. This wasn't finished. There was something still coming. I could feel it. The way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken to me, it was as if he desired me, and it drove me crazy, as something in me desired him too. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Davison and I had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't just about casual conversations on the porch anymore. There was a connection between us, something unspoken but undeniable. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to him even more. I'd catch glimpses of him working in his yard or sitting on his porch, and my heart would quicken in a way I couldn't explain. There was a warmth in his presence, a comfort that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. And as much as I tried to tell myself that it was just a friendly connection, a part of me wondered if it was something more. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself back on his porch again, a glass of whiskey in hand. The air was warm and still, the faint scent of summer blooms lingering around us. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one. Finally, Mr. Davison spoke, his voice low and measured. "You know, Ethan, I never thought I'd find myself here, sharing drinks with my neighbor and talking about life. It's nice." I smiled, the sincerity in his words warming me more than the whiskey. "I feel the same way," I admitted. "It's easy to talk to you." He turned to look at me, his gaze lingering for a moment. I thought he might say something more, but he simply nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged, as though we were both waiting for something neither of us could name. And in that quiet moment, beneath the canopy of stars, I realized just how much Mr. Davison had come to mean to me. He was not only a neighbor, he was so much more. I could just feel it. In some way, I was really very attracted to him, and I wasn't sure yet, but I think he was attracted to me too. The days that followed felt like a slow dance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Mr. Davison and I fell into a rhythm, as if our lives had always been intertwined this way. The porch conversations turned into longer evenings inside, and soon it became natural for me to knock on his door instead of waiting for him to appear outside. Sometimes there were small touches, just hinting that there was more coming. Each time I stepped into his home, it felt like entering a world set apart from everything else, a quiet refuge where time seemed to slow down. Mr. Davison's presence was magnetic. He didn't need to command attention with grand gestures or flashy words. It was in the small things, the way his voice softened when he spoke about something close to his heart, the quiet hum of contentment as he refilled our glasses, or the way he leaned forward slightly when he listened, as though my words were the only ones that mattered. Eventually, he invited me to stay for dinner. It was a small gesture, but something about it felt different. There was a subtle shift in his tone, an undercurrent of anticipation that made my pulse quicken. "I'm not much of a chef," he warned with a self-deprecating smile as he placed a plate of pasta in front of me. "But I promise it's edible." I laughed, taking in the sight of him. He wore an apron over his button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the room, mingling with the faint trace of his cologne. It was domestic, intimate, and utterly disarming. This looks great, I said, picking up my fork. You're underselling yourself. He shrugged, sitting across from me. I've had a lot of time to practice. The remark hung in the air, a quiet nod to the hours he'd spent alone while his wife was away. I wanted to ask more, to understand the weight he carried, but the vulnerability in his eyes held me back. Instead, I focused on the meal, savoring the flavors and the unspoken connection between us. As we ate, the conversation flowed as easily as ever. He shared stories of his younger years, of impulsive road trips and nights spent under the stars. His voice carried a mix of nostalgia and longing, as though he were reliving those moments with every word. I used to think those were the best days of my life, he said, swirling the last of his wine in his glass. But now, I'm not so sure. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward. He met my gaze, his expression thoughtful. Back then, it was all about chasing the next thrill, the next high. But I think the best days are the ones where you're truly present, where you can sit across from someone and just feel at peace. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. I get that, I said quietly. It's not about the big moments, is it? It's about the little ones. Exactly, he said, his lips curving into a soft smile. And lately, it feels like there are more of those little moments. The words hung between us, their meaning unspoken but understood. My heart raced, and I felt a pull toward him that was as undeniable as it was unexpected. I wasn't sure if it was the wine, the warmth of the room, or the way his gaze lingered just a second too long. But something in me shifted. After dinner, we moved to the couch, a bottle of wine between us. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but the air was charged with an energy that neither of us acknowledged. I noticed the way his hand rested on the arm of the couch, his fingers tapping lightly against the fabric. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, but it drew my attention like a magnet. At one point, I leaned back, letting out a content sigh. This is nice, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Mr. Davison turned to me, his eyes searching mine. It is, he agreed, his tone low and measured. I didn't realize how much I'd missed having someone around. There was a vulnerability in his words, a quiet admission that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, but I hesitated, unsure of how far I could go. I'm glad I could be here, I said, meeting his gaze. You've been good company. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. You make it easy. The moment stretched between us, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. I could feel the tension in the air, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second. And then, without thinking, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against his. His hand stilled under mine, and for a moment I worried I'd crossed a line. But then he turned his hand over, his palm meeting mine, his fingers curling gently around mine. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I felt my breath hitch. Mr. Davison, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. It's Richard, he said softly. Please. His words were both a reassurance and an invitation, and I felt my resolve crumble. The space between us seemed to shrink, and before I knew it, I was leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of his presence. When our lips finally met, it was tentative, a careful exploration of the emotions we'd both been holding back. His touch was gentle but firm, his years of experience evident in the way he moved, the way he held me as if I were something precious. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was steady, deliberate, and filled with a depth of feeling that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. I didn't think this was possible, he admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. Neither did I said, my voice shaky but honest. But I'm glad it is. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease, as though I'd found a place where I belonged. And as I sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of Mr. Davison's presence, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. Or was I? I did not know what would come next, but sooner, I would definitely find out. The night carried a serene weight, as though the universe itself had paused to take a breath. Mr. Davison and I remained on the couch, the soft glow of a nearby lamp casting warm shadows on his face. His eyes lingered on mine, a mix of gratitude and trepidation swimming in their depths. I could sense the hesitation in him, the years of restraint and responsibility that threatened to pull him back. Are you okay? I asked softly, my hand still resting in his. He nodded, exhaling slowly. I am. It's been a long time since I let myself feel this way. I smiled, understanding the courage it must have taken for him to admit that. Me too, I said, though my experience with vulnerability paled in comparison to his. But I think we deserve this, don't you? Mr. Davison's lips curved into a faint smile, but the weight in his eyes remained. I spent so many years convincing myself that there was only one way to live, that the roles we play, husband, provider, neighbor, define us entirely. But lately, he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window where the moonlight spilled onto the floor. Lately, I prompted, leaning in slightly. Lately, I've been wondering what else there is, he said, turning back to me. What it might mean to choose something for myself, to feel something just because I want to. His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I squeezed his hand gently, anchoring him to the moment. You can, I said simply, and you don't have to apologize for it. He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the truth of my words. When he opened them again, there was a quiet determination in his gaze. You're something else, Ethan, he said, his voice low and filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through me. We sat there for a while, the silence between us filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. I could feel the shift in him, the way his shoulders relaxed and his grip on my hand steadied. He wasn't fighting it anymore. He was allowing himself to be present, to let the moment unfold without resistance. Eventually, he stood, tugging me gently by the hand. Come with me, he said, his voice soft but firm. I followed him without question, my heart pounding in anticipation. He led me to the kitchen, where the remnants of our dinner still sat on the table. The mundane scene felt almost surreal now, like a snapshot of a life that had suddenly become more vivid. I didn't want the night to end just yet, mister, Davison said, picking up the wine bottle and refilling our glasses. I like having you here. I like being here, I replied, leaning against the counter. It feels right. He handed me a glass, his fingers brushing mine in a way that sent a jolt of electricity through me. You've brought a lot of light into this house, he said, his voice tinged with emotion. More than I realized I needed. We moved to the dining table, sitting across from each other as we sipped our wine. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did, but there was a new depth to it now, a sense of intimacy that made every word feel significant. Mr. Davison told me stories about his younger days, moments that shaped the man he had become. He spoke of dreams he'd let go of, choices he'd made out of duty rather than desire. It was clear that his life had been full, but also marked by sacrifices he hadn't always been prepared for. I don't regret my life, he said, swirling the wine in his glass, but sometimes I wonder if I got so caught up in doing the right thing that I forgot to ask myself what I really wanted. His honesty took my breath away. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. It's not too late to figure that out, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. You still have so much life left to live, mister. Davison's gaze met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw the beginnings of tears in his eyes. You make it sound so simple, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it is, I said with a small smile. Sometimes the hardest part is just letting yourself believe it. We sat there, our hands entwined on the table, as the world outside seemed to fade away. In that moment, nothing else mattered, not the past, not the expectations that had weighed him down, not the uncertainty of what lay ahead. All that existed was the quiet connection between us, and the unspoken promise that we would navigate whatever came next together. Eventually, the wine glasses emptied, and the house grew still. Mr. Davison looked at me, his expression soft but resolute. Stay, he said, this little word carrying a depth of meaning that left no room for hesitation. I nodded, my heart full. I'm not going anywhere. He stood, extending his hand to me once again. I took it without hesitation, letting him lead me through the dimly lit house to the living room. We settled on the couch, his arm draped around my shoulders as I leaned into him. The night stretched on, and with it came a quiet sense of belonging that I hadn't realized I'd been searching for. Wrapped in the warmth of Mr. Davison's presence, I felt a kind of peace that was entirely new to me, one that came not from excitement or novelty, but from the simple act of being seen and accepted for exactly who I was. I had never slept with a man before, but Mr. Davison really let me feel good. As I looked him in his eyes as we lay beside each other, his eyes were giving me that desire again. Let's get over that marriage with a little excitement. What do you think? Oh my God, I had definitely sipped too much wine. I hadn't expected it, but he immediately gave in and kissed me right on the lips, not even thinking of what his wife would think of it. A bit soft first, but I turned it into something deeper quickly. I can't tell you anything, of course, but as I went down, he looked me in my eyes with those sharp eyes of his. I could see he was enjoying what I did to him. After 10 minutes, we even went further. This was amazing, and he found it amazing too. I can tell you we went on for quite long, I think definitely longer than an hour. And when he finished, I lay down, realizing what had just happened, what I just had done. All of a sudden, I noticed I turned very sleepy, and I must have dozed off very soon after. As the minutes turned into hours, I knew that this was only the beginning of something far greater than either of us had imagined. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the room. I woke to the quiet sounds of birds chirping outside, my head resting against Mr. Davison's chest. His arm was still draped around me, and his breathing was deep and even, a peaceful rhythm that made the world feel safe. For a moment, I stayed perfectly still, savoring the tranquility of the moment. It felt like the kind of morning I'd always hoped for, simple, quiet, and filled with a sense of belonging. Eventually, Mr. Davison stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he looked down at me. A slow, warm smile spread across his face, and he gave a soft chuckle. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm under his gaze. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling this content," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Me neither," I said, smiling back at him. "This feels right." "It does," he agreed, his expression softening more than I ever expected it would. We stayed like that for a while, the weight of the world kept at bay by the stillness of the moment. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with words. Everything we needed to say was spoken in the way we held each other, in the way his hand absent-mindedly traced circles on my arm, in the way our breaths synchronized as if our bodies had found their own rhythm together. Eventually, hunger began to creep in, and Mr. Davison reluctantly pulled away. "I think I owe you breakfast," he said with a grin, sitting up and stretching. "You don't owe me anything," I said, following him into the kitchen. "But I'm not going to say no to your cooking." He laughed, the sound light and free as he rummaged through the fridge. "How do you feel about omelets?" "Perfect," I replied, taking a seat at the counter. As he worked, I watched him with a sense of quiet admiration. There was something grounding about the way he moved, his actions steady and purposeful. It reminded me of why I had been drawn to him in the first place, his quiet strength, his ability to make even the simplest moments feel meaningful. When he placed the plates in front of me, the aroma was mouthwatering. "You've really outdone yourself," I said, taking a bite. The flavors were perfect, just like the man who had made it. Mr. Davison smiled, sitting across from me. "I wanted to make this morning special," he said, his tone earnest. "You did," I assured him, "more than you know." After breakfast, we found ourselves back in the living room, the weight of the previous night still hanging in the air, but in a way that felt comforting rather than heavy. Mr. Davison leaned back on the couch, his gaze distant for a moment before he spoke. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For so long, I convinced myself that part of my life was over, that it wasn't something I could have anymore." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "You can," I said firmly, "and you deserve to." His eyes met mine, and there was a rawness there that made my chest tighten. "It's scary," he admitted, "letting myself feel this way, letting myself want this." "I know," I said softly, "but you're not doing it alone." He nodded, his expression softening. "I don't think I could have done this without you, Ethan. You've made me realize that it's okay to want more, to want something for myself." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "And you've shown me what it means to truly connect with someone, to see them for who they are, not who they think they have to be." The moment lingered, the silence between us heavy with unspoken promises. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of quiet resolution. This wasn't just a fleeting connection. It was the start of something that had the power to change us both. As the day wore on, we talked about the future, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in the small, meaningful ways that made all the difference. We spoke of shared dinners, lazy mornings, and the kind of companionship that made even the most ordinary moments feel extraordinary. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. Mr. Davison sat beside me on the porch, his hand in mine, as we watched the world slow down around us. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft, "I used to think my best days were behind me, but now, Now I'm starting to believe they might still be ahead. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. They are, I said confidently, and I'll be right here with you. We stayed like that as the night fell, the stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky. The weight of the past no longer felt so heavy, and the uncertainty of the future didn't feel so daunting. All that mattered was the here and now, and the quiet promise of what was to come. I still feel good about what I did. Helping a neighbor is what we do, don't we? Whatever he needs. What do you think of what I did? Let me know in the comments. Thank you.